Sometimes it's asked, why do the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say Jesus died and was resurrected? Well, my theory that I'm beginning to really believe is that the Gospel of Mark was influenced by the Pauline epistles. So even Christian scholars, like if you go to the progressivechristianity.org website, even like Christian ministers and Christian scholars do believe, some of them at least, believe that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were influenced by Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, etc. So the reason why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say Jesus died by crucifixion is because of the theological influence of Paul's letters. Now keep in mind that Paul and the disciples got into fights with one another and they weren't preaching the same thing about Jesus. See 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 4 to 5, where Paul says there were disciples preaching a different Jesus than what he was preaching. So what is the Jesus Paul was preaching? The crucified, the dead, and the resurrected Jesus, right? So he's saying they're people, disciples, since the only people preaching Jesus were the disciples, or the disciples of the disciples, were preaching a Jesus who, was the exact opposite of Paul's Jesus. So it's possible that these disciples were adhering to the Q gospel, which had nothing about Jesus' death, but in resurrection, but it taught the Q gospel talked about Jesus' disappearance or assumption into heaven alive, as the Q gospel says in the sign of Jonah, and you will not see me, which is Jesus' rescue from death and Jesus' translation or assumption into heaven. But anyways, regardless, getting back to what I was saying is that the Gospels have a theological reason and not a historical reason for saying Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, because this goes back to their influence from Paul's theology. And Paul's theology was that Jesus died for your sins, as he says in 1 Corinthians, Romans, etc., and that Jesus was resurrected. So that death and resurrection narrative didn't come from the disciples; it came from Paul, as we see in Galatians 1, chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. So Paul made up the whole death and resurrection narrative, not the disciples. And the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John copied Paul to fit the Pauline idea that Jesus died for your sins and was resurrected and ascended. This is all Paul's made up Christology, not the disciples' Christology. So the Gospels were influenced by Paul and his corrupted theology.